Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. We've been doing these programs throughout the lockdown, and somehow they're becoming increasingly important because the whole object of the exercise was to do programs which would help people, in a sense, engage with the difficulties, both with regard to the lockdown, with COVID-19, with the economy and democracy, and the future of South Africa as we emerge out of this dreadful situation which we're in. And they're there essentially to help people negotiate this. And today we have somebody I'm really privileged to have, because he's been writing extensively, thoughtfully, and very, very importantly about so much with regard to the lockdown and COVID-19. And that is Professor Alex van der Heever. And I have to look at my cell phone to get his title right, because I'm going to get this wrong otherwise. He is the chair in the field of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at Wits. Alex, thank you very much for doing this for us. And I wonder whether I can start off by asking you, if you're a member of the public like me, and unlike 90% of my friends, not regard myself as an epidemiologist, a virologist, or an expert in the field, just an ordinary Joe Soap, it's an extremely confusing situation to be in, to know precisely what should be happening in the light of whether, in fact, we should continue with the lockdown, not continue with the lockdown. So guide us here. Your position, as I understand it, is that, in a way, what we're doing at the moment is somewhat counterproductive, or have I got you wrong?
Yeah, so I think that the initial phase of the lockdown could be regarded as well-timed and potentially useful, provided that the period of the lockdown was used productively. The lockdown itself is an extraordinarily damaging intervention because it shuts down everything. The supply side, demand side of the economy, shuts down all sorts of services, shuts down streams of income to vulnerable people, essentially reduces their access also to important healthcare and other services. So if it's used as a measure, it should be used only as a temporary intervention. That's within the South African context. So the attack on the disease itself requires other public health interventions. But if the epidemic takes off, and we're not used to this, many countries have not been used to such an infectious disease, which has a relatively high mortality rate for it. So the morbidity and the mortality is relatively severe. That combination is the scary bit and has resulted in urgent action. But to address an epidemic like this, we would have to use measures that actually keep many of the functions of society going. And what the lockdown provided us with some space to do was to put those in place. And but there's no possibility that the lockdown can be used as our primary intervention going forward. It can't possibly be.
So let me ask you this: what's the primary intervention going forward?
So what many countries have focused on, the central problem, the central prevention focus in an epidemic like this is to separate the infected people from the uninfected people as expeditiously as possible. It's as simple as that. A lockdown does a bit of that. It does it without being very precise or surgical. So the most appropriate method, the tried and tested method in epidemics, is testing and contact tracing. Now, the more infectious the disease is, the faster that has to happen. So the turnaround time for testing is very important, and the turnaround time for contact tracing is very important. Otherwise, you don't get the preventive effect. You can't separate the infected from the uninfected quickly enough to prevent the further onward spread of the disease. So that's the one measure, but you don't do that on its own. You've got a lot of other sort of ambient measures which are important: general social distancing, health protocols at all the sites where communities effectively mix, like places of employment, bulk transport, schools, movie theaters, churches, and department stores. So all of those areas represent areas where the disease is transmitted between communities. So the lockdown attacks those as well, but if you're protecting those using other means, you can help contain the epidemic. So that's our problem. Get to them fast, otherwise the preventive effect is not strong.
My understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, when we're testing people, it's taking quite a long time for the results to come back, which means that people can continue infecting, because unless you've got the result, which is positive, you don't know what, I mean, people wander around the community.
Yeah, so first of all, the kind of average rate, sort of reproduction rate of the epidemic is sort of 2.5 per individual is affected over a period of 4 days. That's a very crude average. The reality is that average is made up of super spreaders and it's made up of hermits. So you've got so you're kind of lucky if the epidemic begins with a hermit because they infect nobody. But if you start with super spreaders, people who are socially engaged, moving around a lot, then you're going to have a lot of people infected by that one particular person. So so you want to basically be able to contain that. So yeah, you can, so a number of measures, the social distancing and the other health protocols, wearing of masks, actually impacts on the super spreaders. In fact, without necessarily stopping forward and onward infections, it does bring it down. So we do have to deal with that part of it. Testing and tracing is critical to get to the super spreaders because you immediately want to find out who those people are and stop them. But at the moment, what's happening is the tests are coming back between 2 and 10 days. So you'd have noticed there was an interview with the first person to be found at Khayelitsha, and she's interviewed, and she points out that she got her test back 9 days after the swab was taken. That was in Khayelitsha. So the inappropriate prioritization of tests in that instance clearly caused would have contributed to that epidemic. You would have had to turn that around in 24 hours minimum, and they'd failed to do so. And then the contact tracing is taking even longer.
So listen to, for example, Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize economist, talking about America, accept that, was talking about the fact that there's some new system where you can test through saliva and you get results in 4 hours. Now, unless you got that sort of scenario, that seems to me to make eminent sense. If you could do that, you would be able to isolate people quite easily. You could even have aeroplanes running pretty smoothly because you could say, unless you've tested and unless you've tested negative on that basis, you can't get on the plane. But if we're going to have 2-3 days, even at best, then the system of testing and contact tracing surely just not going to get us very far. That's what creates anxiety, surely.
So certainly the way that I looked at it right at the beginning, and certainly try to argue, was that this was our must-have strategy. So if this is our highest strategy, given that a lockdown costs about 13 billion rand a day, it really doesn't matter what testing and tracing costs. If it costs 30 billion rand, it's under 3 days of lockdown cost. So it becomes your highest priority. Get through all the obstacles. If you listened this morning to the Minister of Health defending the fact that they haven't got testing and tracing up to the levels that are required, he's saying, oh, well, we've got constraints, we've got this and that. To me, those are excuses. This was our must-have strategy at the level of the president. If we have international diplomacy, if we have a shortage of funds, fund it. If we have to corral and get the support of multinational drug companies, do it. It's our must-have strategy because we can't do anything else. And the thing is that we are facing obstacles now, and it's difficult. And basically, they're saying there were certain fundamental obstacles to getting this right, and it's not clear there were. So I think that there is a big problem. It puts us in a very, very difficult position going forward.
So can I just ask you this? I mean, assuming we had the money, and I mean, you make out a cogent case that the money is small change compared to what it costs the economy if we do nothing. In other words, if we have a complete lockdown. And Romer's basically said the same about the US, where he said basically $100 billion is what it would be, the kind of testing he's thinking about, whereas trillions of dollars are going to be thrown down the toilet because of the economy. can we, if we had the money, could we do it? In other words, if we wrote out a check, you and I, not that we got the money, but assuming we wrote out a check for whatever it cost, and there's the money, could South Africa actually do the kind of testing that you're suggesting is imperative?
So there's two things to consider. One is if the new infection levels rise above a certain threshold, testing and tracing is not going to work anymore. So it's an intervention that's required when the epidemic is at relatively low levels, which it's been in South Africa. So in other words, it's amenable to testing and tracing as a strategy. The second issue is, could we get it up to scale? In my view, if money is not a constraint, you've actually got to work out what the constraints could be. I can't imagine, and I don't accept, that there are fatal obstacles to the scaling up of testing and tracing. I would have a full investigation into what was done. So, for instance, on contact tracing, now countries have contact tracing apps allowing for instantaneous contact tracing. Bluetooth links, the rest, you can be warned if you're in close proximity to somebody who's now tested positive. A presumptive positive, you might say, please be aware that you might have been close to a presumptive positive. So be careful. That's now being done around the world. South Africa has 50 different companies that can produce that overnight. We still don't have one. So that's a suggestion that we haven't prioritized this intervention. On the testing side, you're pointing out those tests that people are starting to do all over the place. They've developed them in South Korea. They've developed them in Europe. They've developed them in the US. It's inconceivable that we do not have access to them. So it's, and what's happening now is government's very quiet about specifically what the constraints are and why they haven't done it. They've just stopped talking about it. So I feel that when everything you're going to throw at this, this is such a high priority, you're going to throw everything at it. It's inconceivable that it wouldn't be done. That every obstacle wouldn't be addressed.
So now we're in the position where there's a significant uptick. Are we in a position where we're in the last chance saloon in relation to this? I mean, if you get to the levels that you're talking about, where the epidemic actually starts getting towards a peak, what do you then do?
So we've got a problem. So you will have noticed now in the Western Cape that they've stopped community-based testing.
Yeah.
And they've done that because the National Health Laboratory Services are unable, they're prioritizing the 24-hour turnaround time for frontline health workers. And the 7 to 10 days that that's taking for the community-based testing is not preventative. So they're essentially shifting to other strategies because they are not able to use the testing strategy to its full effect. After 10 days, forget it.
Yeah.
And then the contact tracing regime is almost valueless. So we're moving toward that point. The question is whether we're doing that nationally. The risk that we would face is that's basically our wall between us and the virus, that intervention, because the lockdown is not going to continue. And if the virus takes over, then we don't really have a targeted measure to suppress the epidemic. So it could basically run its course, whatever that will be, and whatever route it takes within the sort of dynamics of the South African context. So it might level off at a particular level, or at a higher level, or a lower level, but we will be basically facing the worst case scenario, no matter what it is. So my criticism has been in that it appears as though people have been planning for that. And typically when you set up a set of strategic scenarios, you have, here is my optimal strategy, and here's my contingency if it fails. This is what we want to avoid. My concern at the moment is it appears we made the contingency the strategy. And that to me is a real concern.
So now we're in a position whereby we're going to, I mean, for all sorts of economic reasons, we've got to, and other reasons that you mentioned, we're going to reduce the lockdown. We're going to go presumably to level 3. But then just on a common sense point of view, isn't that somewhat troubling in the sense that we now are doing exactly opposite of what everybody else did. Everybody seemed to go into lockdown as they moved up the peak. We now, in order to put it down, we went long before that. Now we're opening up as we start moving into exponential growth of the virus. So does that mean, I mean, what is that? That seems to be odd in a way. Is that because the lockdown is useless? But then what do you do in a situation like that? You're going to now get very many more infections, logic would say.
Yeah, so the lockdown, a generalized lockdown might have worked in France and northern Italy and Spain and the UK. It will work in those contexts because the societies are lockdownable. It's still a devastating effect on their economies and their societies, but they've got a longer runway than we have. In the South African context, the lockdown basically didn't work. And it's a very, very expensive strategy not to work. So whereas in all those environments, you had the reproduction rate of the epidemic drop below 1 because of the lockdown. So in the UK at the moment, they're estimating between 0.7 and say 0.9, which will move them into a relatively safe zone, at which point they will take over with testing and tracing. That's their strategy.
Because sorry, just in ordinary layperson's language, once you get to that level, then the exponential growth starts flattening out, if I could put it that way. Is that right?
So what they're doing as well, when the reproduction rate is below 1, you can still have a lot of new infections every day, but it's on a declining trend.
That's what I meant, yes.
So when it gets to a sufficiently low level, then you can take over with a strategy that can maintain it at that level, which is testing and tracing. And then they can open the economy. So that's their overriding strategy now. Italy, Spain, France, UK are all on very similar downward trajectories due to the lockdowns. South Africa is unique in that it had a total lockdown, and you had this initial decline, which is potentially related to the imported epidemic in the affluent community. So that kind of declined, and then it started to rise as we switched communities. And so that's been the rising trend. It's not exponential, but it's sufficiently above the reproduction rate of 1 for it to move to a point where it can become uncontrollable. So we're rising slowly at this rate, and then it could rise at a higher rate when we basically are run out of bullets. So we shouldn't have had this increase.
I appreciate that, but now that one looks forward, and I appreciate we should have all the inquiries, etc. Now that we're looking forward, I mean, apart from just sort of telling people to wash hands and to have sanitizers and social distancing, are you suggesting that we should open schools, allow movie houses to open, the whole bang shoot? Or are you saying there's still got to be significant restrictions? And if so, what would they be?
Sorry, yeah, I think that we have to prioritize. So there are certain kinds of instances where you probably still have to maintain a closed environment. So for instance, theaters, funerals, et cetera, are going to be problematic. Schools, there's a clear risk, in my view, and other people are less concerned. I would remain concerned, and if it was my child going into the school, I would not be very glib about the risks based on a few international papers. But so schools do involve a high risk of transmission between communities and between households. And we don't really have the measures to properly protect school platforms, which is the concern. So I think that a lot of effort needs to be placed there. In the workplace, it's possible to look systematically at ways of protecting people that need to come into work, and a lot of people can continue to work from home. In terms of bulk transport, the basic measures for protecting people in taxis haven't even been put in place. Taxis should be driving with open windows. Everybody required with masks. They should be at 50% capacity, not 70, and things like that. And you should look at accommodating that regime, because even if you've got masks on, 15 minutes in close proximity to somebody else breathing in an enclosed space is probably going to infect you through a mask. So you need to circulate the air. These are things that we will need to do. So the complete opening up is not a free-for-all. I think we'd have to look at the high risk areas, but we need to open the main engines of South Africa's economy and get that going, and then progressively protect the environments that are much more difficult to protect.
But can I just ask you on that, on the economy, because maybe I'm wrong, and I've put this to a number of people. Let me put it to you. I have no difficulty in agreeing with you that we should be opening up the economy as best we can, given the measures. And I understand that measures, regulations were in fact put in place for the purposes of how you'd organize the workplace, and that there'd be sanitizers and temperatures would be taken and all that. I mean, not perfect, but at least something. But I mean, there are going to be areas of the economy which are just not going to open up come what may, because people won't want to go there, like restaurants or entertainment or even travel, tourism. It's not going to happen. So surely the object of the exercise here is that we should be actually saying, what are the areas of the economy which actually can be opened up where, as it were, they will be able to start growing again, simply because, notwithstanding COVID-19, they don't have those obstacles, like myself feeling I'm not going to go to a restaurant. It's insane to do that. And why we don't seem to have got any plan going as to where we should be putting our priorities. I mean, or am I reading this wrongly?
Yeah, so the way that I'd frame it is that in our approach to dealing with this, you have to have a balance of risks approach, which means that you look, COVID is only one of the range of risks now. Now the interventions are also adding risks. So you have to look at what you do next based on that. The framework that a group of us at Wits have also been sort of examining, what's the rational way to kind of look at this problem? And what we're saying is that you don't close everything by default and then open up by exception. You do it the other way around. You open up as a default and you have the closure by exception. So for instance, the very difficult areas like the tourist industry is going to be in real difficulty going forward, because whether or not you open it up, people aren't going to come anyway. And and the same with restaurants. So you have to look at some repurposing around that. But for the others that are not based on that, by default, they're open subject to protections. You don't need regulations to shut things down. You need regulations that protect people on those platforms. And then you would look to gradually improving the ability for the other things to open up, depending on how you can innovate around protecting people in those environments, and give those industries the opportunity to create that space. But it's still going to be very difficult until we have a vaccine.
But we're not going to get a vaccine for a long time, if we're going to get one.
So that is a contingency. And the only way that certainly I would look at it as at this point in time is that it is a unique moment in time that so much money and so much effort and so many different minds are focused on a vaccine. You can't look at the past history of the development of vaccines. If it is possible to do it, it's going to be done. The only way it's not going to happen is if it's impossible. And okay. I can't believe that it's impossible. So I think that the innovation, the preparation has begun. We've got 100 vaccine candidates, over 100. We've got some already in phase 1 trials, moving into phase 2 very soon. You've got production beginning on some of them in case they work. So I think it is. So it's still a contingency, but it's a better than 50% chance that we're going to get one.
Okay, I appreciate that, but let's not be like Donald Trump here. I mean, at the end of the day, it will take some time. It may only come about this time next year. If we got a vaccine by this time next year, we would have done very well, extremely well. So we still have to plan for at least 12 months ahead, minimum.
Yes. If a vaccine becomes available, it depends on the quantities. So it might be that it's not made available to the general public, but it's made available to high-risk groups and key vectors. So you'd actually prioritize how you would implement the vaccine, because you can actually kill the epidemic without full herd immunity. You can do it just by taking the super spreaders out of the system, as well as protecting the people who are most likely to die. So those are strategies we need.
Is that through a vaccine or is that through other system? When you said
through a vaccine.
a vaccine?
Because I don't believe that we can properly seclude high-risk people if we go for herd immunity just by letting the virus run rampant, the sort of Donald Trump solution.
Well, but not even the Swedes have done that, have they? I mean, my understanding is although they still have controls over gatherings of some sorts, etc.
Yes, what they've done is that they've relied more on kind of bottom-up compliance with social distancing, and for people to measure their own risk, and then they have taken the super spreaders out of the system by banning groupings and things. So it's an approach, but they're not trying to get to herd immunity, which is a bad idea, because you won't be able to protect people.
But Alex, aren't you a bit, I mean, I hear where you're coming from, and it seems to me that what you are talking about is, as you rightly said, you switch the perspective, so you open up, save where you can't. But it seems to me that some of the debate has now been interpreted almost in a libertarian way of saying, well, opposition parties and so on, sort of saying, we've got to open up the economy. It does seem to me that the debate has kind of veered into a kind of control versus libertarian view. And listening to you, there's a via media here between what the government, for example, is doing and what people, on the other hand, just open up are doing, are arguing. And I'm worried that, to some extent, the nuances of your arguments are being lost in the broader scheme of things. That somehow we're not getting the right discourse out there.
Yeah, so I think, and I think it's quite difficult to get a coherent discourse because it will often be immediately boxed in particular ways. I think that the opening of a reasonable opening of the economy is an essential requirement for the country at this point, because the sustainability of government is in question at this point. Its fiscal position, it's unique. It's never been in this position before. You're seeing the Reserve Bank drop interest rates in ways it has never done before. Usually when that happens, it's because people are scared. They're scared of what's happening in the capital markets. And they're scared of whether, when government puts out, tries to borrow money to finance the deficit, that there will be no takers. Now consider that as a situation in South Africa. We could get there if we carry on in this way. So this is not a libertarian view at all. This is about the practical opening of the economy, because it actually preserves our ability to have a functional country, including the government, which is quite critical to sustaining all the interventions. And we're basically breaking that up at the moment. So we have to basically,
Let me carry on. Sorry, I interrupted you. Please carry on.
Yeah, I think that the approach that's taken is open up the key engines of the economy, get the revenue flowing back into government properly so it doesn't have to borrow it, and then sustain the high priority measures going forward. And that's where I say the balance of risk approach means that you have to take each of these elements into account in the next step you take. So at this point, the balance of risks approach would suggest that your default situation is a generally open economy, manage the exceptions, and rather than manage everything and make everybody come and bow and scrape to you to get to open up. It's a bad model. But in this model, you manage the biggest risks from COVID in terms of the open economy. You have your public health interventions escalating as you can, and you have government revenue that gives you the firepower to keep sustaining whatever interventions you need to have for a longer term.
Well, the revenue sources, that may be a very optimistic scenario, because even with your notion, the economy is not going to grow in any way which is going to recompense us for the enormous loss that we've had until now. We are going to be in a significant deficit position by the time we get to next year, come what may.
So my concern is not that we'd be in a deficit position, but that we could be in a fatal deficit position.
Okay, all right.
If we basically put government in a position where it can't even borrow, that's a very, very dangerous position to be in. You're not paying salaries in government anymore, and then you're moving over to the Zimbabwe options, where you start getting the Reserve Bank to buy up government bonds as your way of getting out of that. Then you end up with hyperinflation, collapse of the economy, loss of trust. All of that all starts to degrade very quickly. It's a multifaceted collapse of everything. And that is too complex for this government to solve as a problem. So we mustn't even get close to it.
All right, two final questions. I'm running out of time. I mean, one of the difficulties, I mean, we could carry on this for hours because it's so important, but let me just ask two final questions, if I may. Listening to you, and there's a lot of cogence, in fact, everything is cogent, but it's an excruciatingly difficult issue for any government. No government has done this perfectly. I mean, there is a balancing exercise between the health of citizens and to some extent the economy, which is inextricably linked to how do you do the one without the other. So isn't it, I mean, we're all critical of government, but if you put yourself in their position, there's no government who's done this particularly brilliantly. I mean, aren't we being somewhat unfair on the government to the extent that we're actually asking them to do stuff with the benefits of hindsight of a kind that they never possessed when they went into this in the first place?
So given that the stakes are so high, I don't think that it's unfair to be critical of government's approach to dealing with this problem. If part of their approach involves complicating the problem further, noting that in many of the other countries, they actually have the runway to make mistakes. So we don't. We are not in the position where we can access an EU bailout or the UK finances or the US government. They can make massive mistakes economically in terms of COVID, and they will still be walking at the end of this. We won't. So we have to make government go on the right track. So part of it is also about transparency, the effectiveness and the priorities. What are the priorities that they've chosen at this point? Everything that I've mentioned, if you go and review international practice, those are the priorities everybody else has chosen. And we didn't. We chose tobacco, we chose alcohol, we chose clothing and apparel. We closed down the e-economy. Those are things that haven't been done elsewhere. Why were those the priorities when testing and tracing wasn't? So that's why it's important to be critical of government.
Well, let me take one point, like alcohol. I mean, it is apparently so that as a result of less alcohol, you have less violence and less people landing up in the trauma sections of hospitals. There is some rational basis to that, at least.
There could be. Was that the basis for the decision, though?
I don't know, and neither do you. That's my point.
Exactly. And the point is that if this was an open and transparent process, we would know, because there would be a memo that had been produced and it was provided to the NCCC and they'd have made it public. But the fact is, somebody says, no, we made this decision and you don't have a right to know. When people do that, it suggests that wasn't the reason. Okay,
so that's what I wanted to ask you finally. I mean, one of the people I was going to interview but couldn't, for reasons that everybody now knows, Professor Gray. What do you make of the sort of sensitivity of government to, the kind of criticism from scientists in this, well, particularly scientists who have been involved in the process? Doesn't that, I mean, this seems kind of odd to put it mildly, or is it just part of what you would think would be a somewhat less transparent process than we deserve?
I think that, yeah, so it's a bunch of things there. On the one hand, the question is whether or not the Ministerial Advisory Committee involving a bunch of scientists was used as nothing but window dressing for decisions they made without their input. If that's one aspect of this, which is particularly concerning. The second is questioning the information that's coming to them for decision making, the questions they're allowed to answer, and then the information that's coming to us to know how they've made their decisions. I think that those are the sort of the array of issues she raised. And if we, teach governance and we'll teach ethics within governance courses, and in all of those, there's a point at which people face ethical dilemmas. Do they go with the group and stick to it when they see something that is blatantly wrong, or do they speak out and take a risk and possibly be squashed? Well, she made the decision to do the latter.
But can I just ask you on that? I've just been wondering about this, not in terms of Professor Gray. And let me place on record, I have the highest, I mean, she's a fantastically eminent scientist who I, like most people, have the highest regard for. The question is, I was wondering about this in a slightly different context with Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci. And watching them and thinking, at some point, do you resign? At some point, you say, I can't be part of this anymore because it's quite absurd. to allow the politicians to carry on like this, and I can't say what I really believe? Isn't there a point where you have to say, I can't give you advice anymore because you keep ignoring it?
You've kind of seen people going through that process before dealing with Trump.
The proper course, that's what I meant.
It is potentially, but I think that sometimes people choose their moments because internally, if they see that there's still some value in them being part of the process, they will be a little bit careful and strategic. But there probably comes a point where they see no more value, and then they go public and they resign. But at a point in time when you go public and you make that ethical choice, you effectively challenge people in positions of official power and they can squash you, and you accept that. The unfortunate thing is that we then lose very important people from parts of processes that are making decisions for all of us. So in Donald Trump's situation, they're thinning out all the really good people. In South Africa, you don't want that to happen. I would prefer that somebody like Linda Gray is in a position to make these critical comments that are, after making a brave ethical choice, and that she sustains in her positions. The backlash is...
Yeah. I mean, if it's a case, I suppose what we're saying is, if government gets criticized, you take a deep breath of your government and say, I want every expert that I've got playing for me in my side, because this is unprecedented and we need every bit of expertise we can muster. I suspect that's what you really are saying.
Yes, I think so in a situation like this, you want to fight with all your resources, your enemies and your friends. You want everybody to be part of trying to create a solution here. In this, when you've got a problem that's as complex as this, you actually want somebody who is not beholden to groupthink, who's just going to sit there and say yes because somebody in a senior position told them to. They're going to actually try and do something. And when people do try and do something, then they cause dissent. That's the nature of it. So you can create a process which accepts dissent, or you can create a process which penalizes it. We're seeing a bit of that. And I think that Glenda's helped break through, but she's been quite viciously attacked. And she's not really in a position to defend herself anymore, so she's gone quiet. So I think that we don't really want that. We want people to be able to say what they want, what they need to at the right time.
Well, that's a very important point, because it goes to the center of constitutional democracy and deliberative democracy, which we're supposed to be a model. I've run out of time, Alex van der Heever. Thank you so much. This is exactly the kind of debate we've got to have, given the unprecedented circumstances we're in. And as I've indicated, one has sympathy, certainly I do, with the difficulties that government has. But the truth is we can only evaluate them if we have transparent and kind of accountable government and the sort of deliberation that you and I have engaged in this afternoon. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.